It began in a silent palace on the edge of the Thames, where the most powerful woman in the world refused to lie down. It was the 21st of March, in the year 6003, and Queen Elizabeth of England had not eaten, not slept, not spoken a full sentence in days. Her ladies begged her to rest, to sit, to take even a sip of water, but she only stared into the dark corner of the chamber and whispered, "If you knew what awaited me in that bed, you would not lie down either." For 15 hours she stood, swaying under the weight of a crown invisible but crushing, and everyone in that room knew something far more terrifying than death was waiting for her that night. The courtiers thought it was guilt. They whispered that the ghosts of the people she had killed were haunting her Mary, Queen of Scots, her cousin, the Earl of Essex, her beloved favourite, and Anne Boleyn, the mother she could barely remember. But those ghosts were nothing compared to the one truth she feared, most her own body. For nearly 70 years, Elizabeth had ruled England through brilliance, manipulation, and myth. Yet beneath the layers of silk and lead paint was a secret that could have destroyed everything. A secret that explained why she never married, why she called herself the Virgin Queen, and why she chose loneliness over love. The greatest ruler of her age was also its most fragile prisoner, trapped not by kings or enemies, but by her own flesh. To understand that secret, we have to go back to the beginning, London. May 19th, 1536. In a nursery at Hunsdon House, a 2-year-old girl with red gold hair played with her toys while, only miles away, her mother knelt on a scaffold. The French swordsman raised his blade, and with one strike Anne Boleyn was dead. Her father, King Henry VIII, had ordered it himself. That same day, Parliament stripped the child of her title, and the little Princess Elizabeth became merely Lady Elizabeth, an orphan of the living. Before she could even speak in full sentences, she had learned that love could kill. From that moment, her world became a lesson in betrayal. She watched stepmothers come and go, Jane Seymour dying in childbirth, Anne of Cleves cast aside, Catherine Howard executed like her mother, and Catherine Parr, the only kind one, marrying a man who would turn Elizabeth's life into a nightmare, Thomas Seymour. Her stepfather entered her room before dawn, whispering, laughing, pretending affection while his hands wandered where they should not. He called it play. History now calls it abuse. When the scandal broke, he was executed for treason, and the teenage Elizabeth was interrogated for weeks. Yet she never confessed, never broke. In that fire, she learned the first rule of survival: trust. No one, control everything, show nothing. When she finally took the throne in the year 1558, at 25 years old, the first question every man asked was the same: whom will you marry? But Elizabeth had already seen what marriage did to queens. It killed them. Her sister Mary's marriage to the Spanish king had made her a puppet. Her mother's marriage had ended in blood, and her own brush with Thomas Seymour had burned the word love into a curse. So she made her refusal into power. She turned virginity into weaponry. A new kind of monarchy that needed no husband. Noirs, only legend. While foreign princes sent portraits and proposals, Elizabeth smiled, promised nothing, and made the world wait. Every negotiation became a chess game. Every flirtation, a diplomatic trap. She was never the prey. She was the hunter. But her body betrayed her in ways she could not hide. At 29, she was struck by smallpox and nearly died. When she survived, her face bore scars. Her hair thinned, and her mirror became her greatest enemy. To preserve her image, she began covering her skin with a white paste made from lead and vinegar, Venetian ceruse. It gleamed like marble and killed like poison. She wore it every day for 40 years, painting herself into a ghost while her organs slowly absorbed the metal. The mask that made her a goddess was destroying her from within. And then there was Robert Dudley, the man she loved, the man she could never have. They had known each other since childhood, shared the Tower of London as prisoners once, and shared something deeper than politics ever could. When his wife, Amy Robsart, was found dead at the bottom of a staircase with a broken neck, the scandal consumed them both. Murder, suicide, accident, no one could be sure. But one thing was certain, Elizabeth could never marry him now. To do so would look like confession. So she locked her heart behind the crown and called it sacrifice. She gave him everything except her hand. And when he died years later, she kept his final letter beside her bed until her own last breath. It was found there, marked in her handwriting. His last letter. As the years passed, she became more myth than woman. Her face turned white, her teeth black, her wigs higher, Herr Jewels heavier. The mask was no longer disguise. It was her identity. And behind that porcelain shell, her body continued to fail. There were whispers from her physicians that she was barren, that she suffered from strange internal pain, that she could never have children. Some said she had a malady in her breast. Others that she was not fully woman at all. Whatever the truth, she knew it must never be revealed. A queen who could not bear an heir was a queen who could not rule, so she fought to keep her secret, even if it meant dying on her feet rather than lying down to be examined. In the end, that is exactly what she did. For 10 days, she refused food, refused medicine, refused to sleep. Her ladies spread cushions on the floor because they feared she would collapse. And when she finally did, she still would not move to the bed. Her eyes were hollow, her voice barely human. And yet when her counselor dared to tell her, "Your Majesty, you must go to bed," she hissed back, "Must is not a word to use to princes. Little man, even dying." She defended her throne. When they finally lifted her onto the bed, she knew she would never rise again. She clutched Robert Dudley's letter in her hand, and 3 days later, before dawn on March 24th, the Virgin Queen was dead. But death did not end the performance. Her attendants refused to let anyone cut her open. No autopsy, no examination. The reason, they said, was to preserve her purity. The real reason, perhaps, was to keep her secret buried forever. And yet her body rebelled one final time. The lead coffin burst from within, swollen by the gases of decay, as if even in death she refused to be contained. For centuries later, historians still argue about what killed her poison. Illness or fear. Some say she suffered from a hidden disorder. Others that she was simply poisoned by her own perfection. All agree on one thing. Elizabeth Tudor built a legend so powerful that it devoured the woman beneath. So when you picture that last night in Richmond Palace, the pale queen standing in candlelight, her body trembling, her face white as bone, refusing the bed that would end her, remember this was not madness. It was mastery. It was the final act of control from a woman who had spent a lifetime turning pain into power. She had outlived every enemy, silenced every rumor, ruled for 44 years without a husband, and carried a secret so dangerous she took it to her grave. And that is where our story begins, the illness behind the legend, the woman behind the mask, and the secret that made England's Virgin Queen choose eternal loneliness over love. She was not born a queen, nor raised to rule, but to survive. Before she was crowned, Gloriana, before the white mask and the jeweled gowns and the power that made nations tremble. She was simply Elizabeth, a small girl with eyes too serious for her age, and a heart already learning the language of loss. The first sound that echoed through her life was the stroke of a sword. The day her mother died, the wind that swept through the Tower of London carried the metallic scent of blood and silence. Anne Boleyn, radiant, defiant, a queen only in name for 1,033 days, had been erased, and in a nursery at Hunsdon House, her daughter continued to play, unaware that in one brutal instant she had become both orphan and disgrace. Henry VIII did not weep. He celebrated, perhaps even smiled. He had rid himself of the wife who failed to give him a son, and had already chosen another to take her place. From that moment, Elizabeth's name was scrubbed from prayers, her title stripped, her mother's memory spoken only in whispers. A child of 2 years old was already marked by her father's wrath. The years that followed were years of shifting faces and uncertain love. Jane Seymour came and went in a haze of childbirth and death. Anne of Cleves arrived with a foreign accent and left with a generous settlement. Catherine Howard danced her way into Henry's favour and then, like Anne, met the executioner's blade. Each queen became a ghost in Elizabeth's mind. Each ending a lesson carved into her heart. Beauty fades. Love betrays. And the crown devours its own. By the time Catherine Parr entered the story, gentle and learned and kind, Elizabeth was already cautious, already watching the world with the wary eyes of a hunted creature. Catherine gave her books, language, affection, and the illusion of safety, but even that sanctuary would curdle into dread when Thomas Seymour stepped through the door. He was handsome, charming, the kind of man who thought his smile could turn sin into sport. In the early hours of the morning, he would enter Elizabeth's chamber, dressed in nothing but a nightgown, and pull back her covers under the guise of teasing. She was 14, brilliant, sheltered, too young to name what was happening. Her governess pleaded with him to stop, but he laughed, swearing by God's precious soul that he meant no harm. Even Catherine joined his games, once holding Elizabeth, while he slashed her morning gown open with a dagger, a scene too absurd and cruel to believe if it were not written in testimony. When Catherine discovered her husband embracing the girl, her world collapsed, and Elizabeth was sent away. She left in silence, carrying with her shame she could not name and fear that would never leave her. Months later, Catherine Parr died in childbirth, and Thomas Seymour's ambition led him to the scaffold. Elizabeth watched his execution from afar, unblinking. Something inside her hardened that day, a steel wire twisting itself around her soul. She had learned that desire could kill as easily as a sword, and that love was only another form of danger. When her father died, she was 13, a girl with royal blood, but no safety, living under the shadow of a brother too young to rule and a sister too hungry for vengeance. The court was a labyrinth of suspicion. The tower that had once imprisoned her mother would soon hold her too. Under her sister Mary's reign, Elizabeth endured interrogation after interrogation, accused of rebellion, of heresy, of plots she had not made. She survived by perfecting the art of silence. Every word was a weapon she refused to draw, every breath a negotiation. In those years of fear, she learned that power was not granted. It was taken quietly, without mercy, and without witnesses. When at last the crown came to her, in the winter of 1558, it was not a gift, but a burden she knew she could never set down. She was 25, a woman surrounded by men who doubted her, watched her, and demanded she choose a husband. But Elizabeth had seen what husbands did to queens. She had seen love turn to execution. So she smiled. She flirted. She spoke of marriage as one might speak of a fairy tale, beautiful and impossible. And she never once said yes. Her unmarried state became her armor. The world called her the Virgin Queen. But virginity was not purity. It was defense. A fortress built brick by brick from all the betrayals she had survived. Then came the smallpox. The fire beneath her skin that nearly took her life. When she emerged from the fever, she was changed. Her beauty, once a weapon, had turned against her. Scars crossed her face like pale ghosts. The reflection in the mirror was no longer a queen's but a survivor's. From that moment she painted herself white. A mask of lead that would one day kill her, but made her immortal in the eyes of her people. Behind that painted face, her secrets could not be read. Her scars, her illness, her exhaustion, all hidden beneath the glow of a woman who seemed untouched by time. It was a transformation both alchemical and tragic to become a symbol. She had to bury herself alive beneath her own legend. And through it all, there was Robert Dudley, the boy she had known in the tower, the man she trusted more than any other, the one she might have loved if fate had allowed it. When his wife was found dead at the foot of the stairs, the world erupted in suspicion. The whispers of murder were louder than church bells. If Elizabeth married him, it would confirm the worst. If she did not, she would lose the only soul who knew her as human. She chose the crown, as she always did. Dudley became her shadow, her forbidden reflection, the echo of a life she could not live. For years they danced around each other in the gilded cage of court life hands, brushing in passing. Eyes meeting across candlelight, never crossing the line that would doom them both. When he died, she locked herself away for days, weeping for the man she had already lost decades before. His final letter never left her bedside. It was the one thing she allowed herself to keep as her reign stretched into decades. Her power grew while her body decayed. The white mask thickened, the teeth blackened, the hair thinned until her red wigs became a necessity. But the image of Gloriana, the divine, untouchable queen endured. She outsmarted kings, outlasted wars, and turned her loneliness into empire. Yet behind every triumph was exhaustion. The poison in her paint ate through her flesh. The years of secrets hollowed her mind, and the silence she had chosen became unbearable. By the time her final winter arrived, she was surrounded not by friends but by ghosts. Her mother, her lovers, her victims, her past selves, all waiting in the dark corner of her room. And so when she stood that last night at Richmond, refusing to lie down, it was not pride that held her upright, but terror. The terror of discovery. The fear that if she slept, her body would reveal what her life had concealed, that she was not what the world believed her to be. So she stood in defiance of both death and truth, holding on to her illusion, until her legs gave out and her voice faded to whispers. The courtiers would later write that she died like a lamb, gentle and serene, but the truth was fiercer. Elizabeth did not die peacefully. She died fighting for the only thing she had ever truly owned: her story. A story built on brilliance, deceit, and unbearable solitude. And in that final moment, as the candlelight flickered over the painted mask of her face, the Virgin Queen who had ruled a world finally met the one enemy she could not control: herself. They said she died like a lamb, quiet and easy, slipping from one world into the next, as softly as a ripe apple falling from the tree. But if you had been in that chamber at Richmond, you would have heard something else. The silence of a body that had carried too many secrets. The faint rasp of breath through a throat gone dry from weeks without sleep. The soft creak of fabric as her stiffened legs finally gave way. There was nothing gentle about it. Death did not come as mercy, it came as surrender, wrestled from her only when she could no longer stand guard over herself. Yet to understand how she became that woman, standing in candlelight and refusing her own bed, you must trace the path backward through the corridors of fear that shaped her, back to the child who watched love turn to execution, back to the first lesson she ever learned, that the world would never let her be both woman and safe. In the years after her mother's death, Elizabeth lived like a ghost in her own father's palace, neither royal nor forgotten, just inconvenient. The servants bowed but did not smile. Courtiers whispered that she was cursed, and her father's eyes rarely settled on her. He had remarried before. Her mother's body was cold, and when the new queen gave birth to the long-awaited son, the entire kingdom celebrated, while Elizabeth's name disappeared from every prayer. She was barely 3 when she realized that being born female was a kind of crime. The nursery that had once been filled with songs became a place of silence, and the little girl with the sharp mind learned to observe rather than speak. She began to study faces the way fear hides behind a smile, the way a lie can be told without words. That habit, born of survival, would one day become her greatest weapon. By the time she was 8, she had seen 2 queens die and 1 flee. Catherine Howard's execution was the moment childhood ended for her. The young queen, bright and laughing, had once kissed Elizabeth's cheek and promised her a sister's affection. Then came the whispers, the accusations, the sudden disappearance. When the news of the beheading reached the palace, Elizabeth did not cry. She only asked whether the axe had been sharp. Those who heard her said the question chilled them, because it was not curiosity, it was comprehension. She already understood the pattern. Women who pleased the king died quickly. Women who disappointed him died slower. And from that day forward, she resolved to do neither. When Catherine Parr arrived, she brought books instead of jewels. And for the first time, Elizabeth's world began to bloom again. She studied Latin and Greek until her tutors whispered that the girl's mind was sharper than any man's at court. Catherine treated her as a daughter, calling her "my little scholar." And for a few brief years, Elizabeth believed she might finally belong somewhere. But safety was an illusion, and every illusion in her life eventually shattered. The man who destroyed that peace was Thomas Seymour, the new husband who turned affection into violation. Those early mornings when he crept into her chamber were the hours that carved her heart into armor. Afterward, she learned to lock every door, to wake before dawn, to guard herself from both tenderness and touch. When he was executed for treason, she did not attend the trial. She only asked for the color of the sky that morning, and when told it was red, she nodded as though it confirmed something she had already known, that blood was the only constant she could trust. Under her sister Mary, Elizabeth lived in the shadow of another kind of terror. The new queen saw her as both heir and enemy. Every rumor of rebellion became a noose, waiting to tighten around her neck. Twice she was taken to the Tower, the same cold stones where her mother had waited for death. She walked through those gates, knowing she might never walk out again. And yet she carried herself with the calm of a statue. When the guards expected tears, she offered silence. When the interrogators demanded loyalty, she gave them scripture. It was not faith that kept her alive. It was calculation. She understood that mercy was granted not to the innocent, but to the useful, and so she became indispensable. A symbol of continuity the realm could not afford to destroy. When Mary finally died, Elizabeth emerged from the Tower into sunlight, not as a victim, but as a blade newly tempered by fire. At 25, she wore the crown her father had once sworn she would never touch, and with it came the ghosts of every woman who had died for love. The courtiers expected her to choose a husband. She chose a throne. She told Parliament she was already married to England, and the line became gospel. But behind that declaration was the fear that marriage would mean surrender. To become a wife was to become a possession, a vessel for heirs, a body to be used. She had been groomed, betrayed, nearly destroyed by men who claimed affection, and she would never let one hold power over her again. So she mastered a different kind of seduction. With every prince who sent a proposal, she smiled and delayed, promising possibility while giving nothing. Each flirtation became a negotiation, each compliment a strategy. Her beauty was her sword, her mind the shield behind it, and the court learned that to love her was to be kept waiting forever. Still, there were moments when the mask cracked. When the smallpox struck, she faced her mortality alone. The fever burned her skin, and when the sickness faded, it left her marked. The white paint she began to wear afterward was not vanity but disguise. Underneath it, the scars itched, and the flesh throbbed with pain. Yet she would rather poison herself slowly than let her subjects see her damaged. Over the years, the paint became thicker, the illusion stronger. The woman vanished beneath the performance, and somewhere, in that transformation, she began to believe her own myth that she was chosen. Untouchable, more spirit than flesh. But the body remembers what the mind denies. The headaches grew worse, the sleepless nights longer, and the whispers of hidden illness began to circle the court like flies around a secret wound. Robert Dudley was the one man who pierced the myth. He had shared the tower with her once, and when he looked at her, he saw the frightened girl still standing behind the armor. With him she could laugh, almost freely. Yet even that bond was tainted by tragedy. The death of his wife stained them both. When Amy Robsart's body was found at the foot of the stairs, her neck broken, Elizabeth understood instantly that love would destroy her if she let it. She kept Robert close but unreachable, granting him titles, gifts, trust, but never herself. When he died, years later, she shut herself away, refusing food or light. And when she emerged, the mask was thicker than ever. The letter he left behind became the relic of the life she could not live. As the years turned into decades, her court became a theatre where she performed divinity. Poets called her Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, and she played the role to perfection. Beneath the gold and pearls, her flesh rotted from the lead she painted on it. But she smiled anyway, because the myth demanded it. Her teeth fell, her hair thinned, her mind began to wander. Yet she stood on balconies and declared eternal youth, eternal power. The people cheered the illusion, never seeing the cost. Each layer of paint sealed her further inside herself, until even her own reflection was a stranger. And when at last her body betrayed her completely, when her legs would no longer hold her, and the truth clawed its way to the surface, she refused the only mercy left to her rest. For rest meant exposure, and exposure meant ruin. So she stood, and she stood, and she stood, until standing itself became her final act of defiance. That is the cruel symmetry of her story. The girl who learned to stay awake to avoid the man at her bedside became the queen who stayed awake to avoid the truth in hers. The child who lost her mother to the sword grew into a woman who ruled by it. The body that betrayed her at birth became the kingdom she mastered through will alone. And in the end, when death finally took her, it did not find a saint or a sinner, but something rarer, a woman who had turned her wounds into armor, her fear into power, and her solitude into empire. The older she grew, the more her world became a stage, a glittering mask stretched tight over exhaustion. Every gesture, Every smile, every calculated silence was another line in the script of survival she had written for herself. The courtiers called her radiant, magnificent, eternal, and she gave them what they wanted, a queen who shone like a star. But behind the painted face and the gold-threaded gowns was a body already collapsing under the weight of the lie. Her skin burned beneath the mask of white lead, her stomach twisted with the sickness that came from breathing her own poison, and her teeth, blackened and brittle, made each meal an act of pain. Yet she endured, because the illusion was her power, and to let it crack would be to let the whole kingdom see the decay that time and fear had carved into her. When the courtiers saw her, they saw perfection. When she looked into her mirror, she saw war. The mirror, for Elizabeth, was both enemy and accomplice. She had long ago ordered most of them removed from her chambers, leaving only one, small and covered, a thing she could face only in rare moments of weakness. She would stare at her reflection until the edges of her painted face blurred, and the ghost beneath appeared the woman who had never been allowed to simply live. Every wrinkle told a secret. Every scar was a memory of what she had lost. The smallpox had marked her, but it was grief that finished the work. Robert Dudley's death, her closest friend's betrayals, the endless pressure to remain both woman and god, each loss etched itself into her body, like a signature she could not erase. It was around this time that people began to whisper about her health. Some said she was barren, others that she was not truly a woman, and still others that she was haunted by a private sickness, too shameful to name. The ambassadors wrote letters in cipher, describing the Queen's mysterious ailments, her reluctance to be examined, her refusal to rest. They spoke of swelling, of breathless fits, of strange pains that came without warning. And through it all, she pretended nothing was wrong. Her laughter still filled the court. Her wit still cut sharper than any sword. But the colour in her cheeks came not from youth, but from the rouge she smeared over white lead. No one was allowed to see the truth. Not even her physicians. There were nights when she sat alone by the fire, her skin gleaming like porcelain under candlelight, her mind wandering back through the corridors of her own life. She would think of her mother's execution and wonder if Anne had looked up at the sky before the sword fell, if she had prayed for her child or cursed the man who condemned her. She would think of Thomas Seymour, of his footsteps in the dark, of the smell of candle wax and wine, and of the fear that had taught her to wake before dawn for the rest of her life. She would think of Robert, to the way he smiled when she pretended not to care, of the letter she kept beside her bed, of the life she had denied herself. These were the moments when the mask slipped, when Elizabeth the Queen vanished, and Elizabeth the woman surfaced for a breath before sinking again into the role that had consumed her. But even in her isolation, she was never alone. The ghosts of the past walked with her, whispering in her ear like courtiers demanding audience. Her sister Mary appeared in her dreams, pale and cold, asking whether the fire that burned heretics alive had been worth the cost. Her mother stood in the shadows, silent and unblinking, her neck ringed with invisible steel. Robert Dudley came to her sometimes too, in dreams or in guilt, reminding her that love once existed and that she had let it die for duty. The more her body weakened, the stronger the ghosts became. They were the companions of her solitude, and perhaps the only ones she could trust. Her counselors watched helplessly as she aged. William Cecil, the man who had served her since the beginning, had grown frail and grey. Yet even on his deathbed he begged her to marry, to name an heir, to think of England's future. She smiled at him and said, "I think of nothing else." But what she meant was that she could think of nothing else because she knew she was the future's hostage. Without an heir, The Tudor bloodline would end with her, and that knowledge gnawed at her like a hidden wound. Still, she refused to choose a successor. The moment she did, her own death would become a matter of convenience for those waiting to replace her. She had seen too many crowns change hands in blood to make that mistake. So she ruled on, year after year, her body wasting, her mind sharp but haunted, until even her most loyal servants began to dread her silences. And yet there were flashes of the old fire. When Spain sent its armada to conquer England, Elizabeth rode to her troops at Tilbury in armour, her frail frame hidden beneath silver breastplate and red sash, declaring that she had the heart and stomach of a king. In that moment she was not the virgin queen, nor the lonely woman behind the mask. She was every version of herself made one. The frightened child who had survived her father's rage, the girl who had outwitted interrogators, the queen who had outlived every rival. The soldiers cheered, not for her beauty or divinity, but for her defiance, and perhaps that moment was the closest she ever came to feeling free. But time is merciless, and no performance lasts forever. After the Armada, victory gave way to fatigue. Her nights grew longer, her sleep more restless. The poison in her makeup was eating her alive, and still she refused to stop using it. The few who dared to suggest it might harm her were dismissed or ignored. The white face had become her armor. To remove it was to stand naked before a world that loved perfection more than truth. Even her closest ladies began to fear touching her skin, which had grown dry and cracked beneath the paint. Yet when she entered the great hall, bathed in torchlight, no one could look away. She was a living relic, dazzling and dreadful, the last of her dynasty, a monument to her own endurance. When Robert Cecil, the son of her old advisor, finally gathered the courage to confront her about her health, she laughed, a sound brittle as glass, and told him, "A queen does not die by command of her servants." But later, when the chamber was empty, she pressed her fingers against her pulse and found it thin and uneven. She knew her body was failing. She had felt it for years. The trembling of her hands, the ache in her bones, the dizziness that came without warning. What she feared most was not death itself, but what came after the unveiling, the examination, the discovery. She had built her legend on mystery, and she would not let death strip it away. So when the final illness came, she met it not with peace, but with fury. She refused food, refused doctors, refused rest. She stood for hours until her attendants wept, spread cushions across the floor, and begged her to sit. When at last she sank down among them, she kept her back straight and her eyes open, as if daring God himself to come closer. The candlelight flickered on the white paint of her face, turning it into a mask of stone, and in that strange, holy stillness, she began to fade, not quickly, but slowly, like a star withdrawing from the sky. Even now, century later, historians argue about what killed her: poison, exhaustion, hidden illness, or heartbreak. But perhaps the truth is simpler. Perhaps she died of control. She had spent her entire life mastering herself until there was nothing left to master. And when the body finally rebelled, she could not forgive it. Her death was not a collapse, but a refusal. The final act of a woman who would rather die standing than live as anyone's secret. After the Queen's final breath, a stillness fell upon Richmond Palace that no prayer could lift. The attendants, who had spent days moving in whispered dread, now moved slower still, as though afraid that even their footsteps might wake her. The chamber was thick with candle smoke and the faint, sour scent of decay. Elizabeth's body, draped in velvet and pearls, looked almost peaceful. But the peace was deceptive. Beneath the painted mask, her skin had begun to darken, and the faint trace of blue lingered at the corners of her lips. They said she looked serene, that death had softened her features at last. But those who had seen her living face knew the truth. This was not serenity. It was surrender. And it came far too late. Her ladies knelt around her, weeping, though their tears carried different meanings. Some cried for love, others for fear, a few for relief. For weeks they had watched her resist the inevitable, standing long after her body had failed, clinging to consciousness like a drowning woman to driftwood. Now that the fight was over, they were left with silence and the dread of what came next. No one dared touch her. The room seemed to belong not to the living but to history itself, and every person in it knew they were standing at the edge of an age. The Tudor sun, which had burned so brightly for nearly a century, was dying with the woman who had kept it alive by sheer will. They sent messengers galloping through the night, their hooves striking sparks on the frozen ground, carrying the news that England's Virgin Queen was dead. The word spread faster than dawn. Elizabeth is gone. In the streets of London, church bells began to toll, and the people, hearing the sound, did not at first believe it. How could she be dead? They said, when she had seemed immortal. For 44 years she had been the heart of their world, her face on every coin, her name in every prayer, her shadow in every home. She had become something more than a ruler. She was a symbol of endurance, of victory, of divine favor. And now, suddenly, that light had gone out, and the world seemed colder for it. Inside the palace, her closest attendants faced a different problem. The Queen's body was beginning to change. The physicians had begged to perform an examination, to understand what had killed her. But the council refused. Her purity, they said, must remain untouched. Her secrets sealed within her coffin. Perhaps they feared what they would find beneath the white paint and jewels. Perhaps they already knew. The decision was final. There would be no autopsy. They dressed her in white satin, placed a crown upon her head, and folded her hands around a small crucifix. The candles were replaced again and again, their flames flickering over her still form, as if the palace itself were unwilling to let her disappear into shadow. Days passed, and the air grew heavy. Those who kept vigil began to whisper that the body was swelling. The smell of lead and death seeped into the tapestries, and the servants crossed themselves when they entered the chamber. They said her coffin, when sealed at last, began to groan from within, as if her spirit refused confinement. Whether this was superstition or truth, no one dared to test it. The Virgin Queen had ruled even in death, and now it seemed she would continue to do so from beyond the veil. Her coffin was carried from Richmond to Whitehall by torchlight. The procession slow. The river beneath them, black and still. People gathered along the banks of the Thames, holding candles, their faces pale in the wind. Some crossed themselves. Others simply watched, unable to imagine England without her. While the city mourned, her council met in secret to decide what came next. For all her brilliance, Elizabeth had left the realm unprepared for her absence. She had named no heir, signed no decree. Only one man knew her intentions: Robert Cecil, son of the advisor who had served her father and herself. For months he had been corresponding in coded letters with James of Scotland, the son of her executed cousin, Mary Stuart. It was to him that the crown would pass, uniting the two kingdoms that Elizabeth had once kept apart. When the council declared James king, the transition was bloodless. But the silence that followed was strange and deep. It was as if England itself held its breath, uncertain whether to rejoice or grieve. The funeral procession stretched for miles, beneath a sky the colour of ash. Her coffin, draped in cloth of gold, was borne through London on a carriage drawn by 4 horses, cloaked in black. The people knelt as she passed. They had cheered her victories, cursed her taxes, zong her praises, and feared her temper. But in death, they loved her again. Along the roadside, women threw laurel and rosemary, the herbs of remembrance. The bells tolled all day. And even the ravens at the tower seemed to cry out as she crossed the bridge that had once carried her mother to her execution. There was symmetry in it, cruel and perfect. The daughter who had survived every storm returning along the same road her mother had travelled to death. When they laid her in Westminster Abbey, beside her sister Mary, the irony did not go unnoticed. 2 queens, born of the same father and rival mothers, buried in the same tomb. The inscription carved above them read simply, "Partners in throne and grave. Here we sleep." Yet history would never let them rest as equals. One had ruled through fear, the other through illusion, and both had paid the same price for power loneliness. As the final prayers were spoken, the choir's voices echoed through the vaulted hall, rising to meet the dust of ages. It was said that in that moment, a beam of sunlight pierced through the coloured glass and fell upon her coffin, turning it to gold. Some called it a miracle. Others called it the last trick of a woman who had made even the heavens her stage. After her death, strange rumours spread. Some claimed that her body had blackened before burial, that her veins had burst from the lead poisoning, that her hair had turned to ash in her sleep. Others whispered that she had not truly died, that she walked still through the halls of Richmond on moonlit nights, her white face glowing faintly in the dark. The servants swore they heard her footsteps, the soft rustle of silk, the faint sound of her voice humming a lullaby no one could place. Even now, centuries later, the legend persists that the Virgin Queen refuses to rest because she cannot bear to be seen as human. And perhaps that is the cruelest truth of all. Elizabeth had built herself into a myth so enduring that even death could not dismantle it. She had lived her entire life within the armour of a story, and when the final curtain fell, she remained trapped inside it. The people mourned the queen they believed they knew, but the woman they buried was a stranger to them all. Somewhere beneath the marble and the gold lies not a goddess, but a frightened child who grew up among executioners, who learned to turn fear into beauty, and who paid for her crown with the one thing she never allowed herself to have: peace. Long after her coffin was sealed, the abbey still smelled faintly of roses and lead, a mingling of devotion and poison that seemed to sum up her life. Outside, London carried on, the river still flowing, the bells still ringing, yet something had changed forever. The age of Gloriana was over, and with it ended the last breath of the Tudor dream. The Queen, who had once declared she was married to her people, had finally left them widowed, and in the echo of her silence, England began to wonder whether it had ever truly known her at all. In the months after her death, the silence she left behind seemed heavier than her reign had ever been. England had a new king now, a man she had never named, the son of the cousin she had executed. Yet her shadow lingered in every room, in every whisper of state, as if the great halls and narrow corridors of Whitehall still expected her to appear. Painted white and crowned in flame-coloured hair, the courtiers who had once trembled before her found themselves speaking more softly, as though fearing she might still hear them. For nearly half a century, she had been their sun and their storm, their mother and their warden. And now, without her, even the air felt unanchored, as if England itself was unsure how to breathe without her command. James of Scotland entered London, not as a conqueror, but as a careful guest. Knowing that the throne he inherited was haunted, he found her chambers exactly as she had left them, mirrors veiled, books open, a single candle burned to wax on her desk, beside a letter she had never sent. Some said it was addressed to Robert Dudley. Others believed it was meant for no one. A message written to the ghost of herself. When James read it, his hand trembled. The words were faint, almost erased by time. But one line remained clear. They will never know what it cost. The new king folded the letter away and ordered the chamber sealed. Even he, who owed his crown to her death, could not bear to disturb her ghost. Outside the palace walls, the people spoke her name like a prayer and a curse. The merchants remembered her as the queen who made England rich, the sailors as the ruler who sent them against Spain's mighty armada, and the poets as the muse who turned their words to gold. But among the poor, the memory was more complicated. They remembered the famine, the executions, the endless taxes to fund her wars. To them, she had been both savior and tyrant, a queen who ruled with iron wrapped in silk. And yet even they could not deny her brilliance. Whatever her sins, she had held the country together through sheer force of will, and there was not a soul alive who did not feel smaller in her absence. At night, people claimed to see lights moving through the windows of Richmond Palace long after it had been closed. The guards who kept watch swore they heard faint music, as if from a distant masque. The echo of her court still dancing in time to a rhythm only the dead could hear. Some said it was her spirit. Forever pacing the corridors, she refused to abandon. Still wearing her mask of lead and pearls. Still unwilling to lie down. Others said it was guilt itself, restless and unresolved, haunting the place where her secrets had been buried. Whatever it was, no one dared enter after dark. The queen who had ruled in life, ruled still in death. Her presence, as commanding as ever. There were those who tried to explain her final illness, to make sense of the mystery that had followed her to the grave. The physicians who had served her whispered of mercury tinctures, of lead poisoning that had blackened her blood, of ulcers that ate her from within. But there were other rumors too, darker, stranger. Some believed she had been born with a deformity hidden beneath her silks, something that had made her incapable of bearing children and had driven her to guard her body with such ferocity. Others claimed she had suffered from tumors, or from an unholy infection brought on by the very paints that had made her beautiful. No one could prove anything, for the truth had been sealed with her coffin, and her attendants had sworn never to speak. The mystery only deepened her legend. The Virgin Queen, perfect in life, unknowable in death. Poets took up her story like holy scripture. They called her Gloriana, Astrea, Cynthia, and said she had ascended into the heavens to become one with the stars. But the people who had known her best remembered a different woman, the one who paced at night, muttering to herself, who wept at the sight of her old friend's children, who grew thin and hollow-eyed, as if eaten by loneliness. Her ladies spoke of nights when she refused light or food, when she sat in her chamber until dawn, staring at nothing, her fingers moving as though counting invisible beads of penance. One wrote in her diary that the queen often murmured a single word in her sleep. Mother, it is easy, centurie la terre, to imagine her as something divine, a marble statue in gold and crimson. But the truth was far sadder. She had been human in the loneliest way possible. To be queen was to be worshipped, but never touched, admired, but never known. Her life was a procession of eyes upon her, and no hands to hold her. She had mastered power, but it had devoured everything else. And when the nights grew long and her ladies fell asleep, she would sometimes whisper into the silence, asking the same question she had asked her nurse as a child, whether her mother had loved her. There was never an answer. When James's courtiers began to remove her emblems from the palaces, the tapestries bearing her initials, the portraits with their impossible whiteness, strange things happened. One man collapsed while lifting a painting. Another swore he saw blood bloom across the face of her portrait, as if the paint itself had begun to weep. The servants muttered that she was angry, that her spirit would not tolerate erasure. Even the new king began to hesitate. In the chapel at Westminster, he ordered a light to burn eternally beside her tomb. In honour, he said, of the Queen who made England. But others whispered that it was not honour at all. It was appeasement. In the years that followed, her legend only grew. Ballads were sung of her wisdom, her chastity, her impossible beauty. Children played at being Gloriana in the streets, their faces powdered white with flour, their voices high and proud. But in the deeper corners of the city, in taverns and back alleys, another kind of story spread. They said she had not died at all, that she had made a bargain with the devil to rule forever, that the red-haired woman sometimes seen at twilight on the riverbank was her, wandering endlessly, seeking forgiveness she could never find. In time, no one could tell which tales were truth and which were invention. Elizabeth Tudor had become both saint and spectre. The boundary between myth and woman dissolved. Even now, her marble effigy lies in Westminster Abbey, her face smooth and eternal, her hands folded in prayer. Beneath that stone rests the body that had once held an empire in its fragile frame. When tourists walk past, they see the serene figure of a queen who ruled alone. But if you listen, truly listen, the echo of her story lingers in the stillness, the rustle of silk, the sharp intake of breath, the soft crack of a crown being set down at last. It is the sound of a woman who carried too much and could never let it go. And perhaps that is her truest legacy. Not the empire she built, nor the wars she won, nor the poets she inspired, but the haunting silence she left behind. The silence of a woman who refused to be less than legend, who chose power over love, and in doing so, ensured that neither love nor rest would ever find her again. 4 centuries have passed, and still her story burns cold, bright, and eternal, as though the Virgin Queen herself is standing somewhere in the dark, refusing, even now, to lie down. In the years that followed her passing, England tried to move forward, but her shadow stretched far beyond her grave. The new king sat on her throne, his Scottish voice echoing through halls that still smelled faintly of her perfume. And though he ruled by right of blood, he ruled in the presence of her ghost. The courtiers whispered her name like a forbidden prayer, and when they spoke of policy or war, they still used her reign as a compass. Even those who had once feared her temper now missed the steady hand that had kept them safe from chaos. The Virgin Queen was gone, but her silence governed more powerfully than the voices of the living. James ordered her portraits removed, her motto replaced, her emblems stripped from the court. Yet no matter how he tried, her image would not fade. The people still carried her in their hearts. Her face was carved into memory itself. Children who had never seen her still described her as if they had stood before her, the white face, the red hair, the eyes that could pierce through deceit. Ballads of her victories were sung in the marketplaces, and old sailors told stories of her standing on the cliffs of Tilbury, armour gleaming like moonlight, vowing to defend England with the heart and stomach of a king. It didn't matter that the details had blurred into legend. The myth was too perfect to die. She had become the eternal mother of the realm, the woman who turned vulnerability into dominion. But beneath that admiration was a kind of guilt that no one dared name. The people who loved her had also demanded her loneliness. They had made her their saint, their symbol, their goddess, and in doing so, they had stripped her of the right to be human. The scholars who wrote of her called her divine, untouched, chaste, never realizing that these words were the chains that bound her most tightly. Even in death, they refused to let her rest. Every poet who painted her as immortal carved her further away from peace. And so her legend grew not like a flame, but like frost, beautiful and cold, spreading across time until even her suffering glittered as art. In the quiet corners of London, the older courtiers who had served her spoke softly of her final days. They remembered her eyes, sunken and far away, as if she was already halfway gone. One of her ladies, who had held her hand on the last night, said that Elizabeth's skin had felt like parchment beneath the paint, dry and fragile, but burning with fever from within. Another confessed that when she died, her lips were moving, whispering something no one could hear. Some said it was a prayer, others swore it was a name, but no one ever wrote it down. To speak of the Queen's last words was to break a spell, and England was not ready to let the spell die. Meanwhile, beyond the reach of rumour and memory, her legacy began to take form in the living world. The empire she had dreamed of was stirring. The merchants sailed farther than ever before. Explorers carried her banner across oceans, and poets still wrote as though she watched from heaven. The new king may have worn the crown, but it was her spirit that guided the ships through storms and her myth that gave courage to men who would never see her face. Even in death, she ruled the imagination of her people, and that power was more enduring than any throne. Yet there was one place where her name was not spoken, the Tower of London. There, in the cold stone corridors where she had once walked as a prisoner, the guards said strange things began to happen after her burial. Lanterns would flicker without wind. Footsteps echoed on the stair long after midnight, and a faint rustle, like silk brushing stone, haunted the chambers where she had once wept in silence. One night, a young sentry claimed to have seen her a figure in white, her face pale as moonlight, her eyes fixed on the window that looked toward Westminster. He said she was not frightening but unbearably sad, as if waiting for someone who never came. The officer dismissed him. Of course. But the next morning, the boy refused to return to his post. The tower had many ghosts, but none so proud or so tragic as hers. Historians, centuries later, would write of her as a paradox, brilliant yet broken, ruthless yet tender, alone yet adored. They would argue over what drove her choices. Was it ambition, fear, or the echo of childhood trauma that shaped her? They would study her letters, her speeches, her portrait, searching for the woman behind the performance. And yet the deeper they looked, the more elusive she became. Every discovery only revealed another mask. Some believed she had crafted her own myth consciously, using theatre as a weapon to control how history would see her. Others thought she had simply been consumed by it, that in her final years she no longer knew where the Queen ended and the woman began. Perhaps both were true. Perhaps she had built her crown from her own pain and worn it until it fused with her bones. There was one portrait, painted late in her life, that captures her truth better than any record. In it, she stands in a gown of white and silver, her hand resting on a globe, her expression calm yet distant. Her eyes do not meet the viewers. They seem fixed on something far away, beyond time. The painter captured not power, but exhaustion, the fragile stillness of a woman who has seen too much and cannot put it down. When visitors stood before that painting, some felt unease. as though she were still watching them from the other side, judging silently whether they were worthy of her story. And maybe she was, for even in death, she was not finished. The legend of Elizabeth did not end with her burial. It evolved, shifting to suit every age that followed. In times of crisis, she became the spirit of defiance. In times of peace, she was a symbol of wisdom. To some, she was the mother of empire. To others, the embodiment of sacrifice. But all of these were fragments of the same truth, that she had turned her isolation into immortality. By denying love, she made herself eternal. By choosing the mask, she made herself unforgettable. And in doing so, she condemned herself to be remembered forever. Never forgiven. Never forgotten. When storms gather over the Thames and the rain sweeps across Westminster, people still say she walks again, her white face shimmering against the clouds, her voice caught in the wind that moves the river. They say she looks not toward the past, but toward the future, as if guarding a realm that could never guard her. And perhaps she does, because some souls are too heavy with history to rest. Some stories are too vast to end. And somewhere, in the hush between thunder and dawn, her spirit still lingers. Elizabeth Tudor, daughter of a murdered queen, mother of a nation, and the eternal woman who chose loneliness over love and found eternity instead. Century passed, and yet her name did not fade. Elizabeth lingered in the imagination of England like perfume trapped in silk, impossible to wash away. Painters kept painting her long after her bones had turned to dust, each brushstroke turning her further from woman into myth. Playwrights wrote her as a goddess, historians wrote her as a savior, and poets called her Astrea returned, the Virgin of Justice descended to earth. But in those golden verses and marble portraits, the truth began to slip through their fingers. They loved her brilliance, her defiance, her solitude, but they did not love the cost. They erased the tremor in her hands, the exhaustion behind her smile, the quiet hunger in her eyes. They made her perfect, because perfection was easier to worship than pain. In time, the Age of Empire came to claim her legacy, and they used her image as their banner. The Virgin Queen became the mother of conquest, her likeness stamped on coins that sailed with ships bound for worlds she had never seen. Her white face watched over explorers as they crossed oceans, over merchants who built fortunes from lands she could not name. They said she had dreamed of empire, though she had dreamed only of safety. They turned her fear into ambition, her loneliness into glory. In this new story, Elizabeth became not a woman who survived, but a symbol of destiny, a mask worn by generations who needed her strength but not her humanity. In the great houses of the rich, her portraits hung above fireplaces, her eyes stern and unyielding. Visitors would bow slightly as they entered, as though she could still judge them from the canvas. But what those eyes had once held was not judgment, it was fatigue. Beneath the paint, beneath the gold leaf, she had been so tired. Tired of pretending, tired of holding a world together by will alone, tired of waking each morning to the knowledge that she had outlived everyone she ever loved. And yet she endured, and in enduring, she became immortal. That was the cruelest magic of all. When the poets of later centuries tried to imagine her final moments, they wrote her as triumphant, a queen who faced death like a lion, her eyes bright and unafraid. They could not bear to picture the truth, the trembling hands, the cracked lips, the lead-painted skin that had begun to flake away like plaster from a wall. They could not accept that the greatest monarch in England's history had died whispering to ghosts, still afraid of the bed that waited to swallow her. So they replaced her truth with comfort. They built her a death as beautiful as her legend. And in doing so, They silence the woman once again. Yet history has a strange way of remembering what it tries to forget. In dusty archives and private letters, fragments of her real voice survived. Lines written in her own hand, sharp and weary, still carrying the rhythm of a mind that never stopped calculating. The past cannot be cured, she once wrote, and perhaps that was her epitaph, though no stone bears those words. She knew her own myth was a cage. She knew that centuries later, people would still talk of her purity, her pride, her golden Auge, but never of the girl who woke before dawn because she feared footsteps outside her door. That was the secret she carried to her grave. That power had been her armor, and her prison too. In the years after her death, women began to invoke her name as both blessing and warning. To some, she was proof that a woman could rule without marriage, without compromise, without bending to the will of men. To others, she was a ghostly reminder of what such independence costs. Even now, she stands at the crossroads of admiration and pity, a figure both adored and condemned. Her loneliness painted as virtue, her pain as discipline. The more the world changed, the more she remained the same. Every century remade her in its own image, each generation claiming her as their own reflection. In times of war, she was courage. In times of peace, she was restraint. In the eyes of men, she was a saint. In the hearts of women, she was a warning written in blood and pearl. And yet, somewhere beneath all the retellings, something of her still breathes. The letters she wrote still smell faintly of ink and fear. The dresses she wore still carry the dust of candle smoke and sweat. And the lock of red hair found sealed in a locket beside her portrait still catches the light like living flame. These remnants, fragile and human, whisper against the grandeur of her legend. They remind us that before she was Gloriana, she was simply Elizabeth, child of a condemned queen, survivor of betrayal, a girl who learned too young that love could kill. When historians open her tomb in their minds, when they peel away the myths layer by layer, what they find is not a goddess, but a heartbeat, faint but steady, a mind sharper than steel, a heart stitched together from fear and courage, a body poisoned by the very beauty the world demanded of her. That is who she was, and perhaps who she still is, a woman made of contradictions too strong to break, too wounded to heal. Her story endures because it mirrors something timeless, the struggle between the need to be seen and the fear of being known. Even today, her image glows in candlelit museums, her eyes forever unblinking, her lips curved in a smile too thin to be joy. Tourists stop and stare, whispering of her brilliance, her mystery, her virginity, unaware that she is still performing for them. The silence around her is not peace, it is endurance. Somewhere, through the veil of centuries, the echo of her footsteps still lingers, walking the same endless corridors of power and solitude. And when the wind moves through Westminster Abbey, brushing against the stone where she lies, it almost sounds like the rustle of silk. In that whisper is everything she was: grace and fury, faith and fear, beauty and decay, the queen who never married, the woman who never rested, the legend who never died. She has become England's eternal reflection, radiant, haunted, untouchable. And if you listen closely, you might still hear her voice in the distance, cool and steady, repeating the words that outlived her. I may have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king. Words forged from defiance, spoken by a woman who turned her pain into empire, her loneliness into legend, and her death into eternity. long after her body had become dust and her crown had dulled to silence. England continued to dream of her. The centuries changed their clothes, but not their longing. And each age summoned Elizabeth's ghost in a new disguise. To the Victorians, she was an emblem of restraint and empire, a paragon of virtue wrapped in lace and steel. To the poets of the Romantic Age, she was tragic and radiant, the woman who burned so brightly she scorched herself away. In war, her name was a talisman for courage. In peace, a hymn to the discipline of solitude. And through it all, the truth slipped further into the mist, leaving only her reflection brighter, colder, untouchable. Her story became the mirror England held up to itself. And like all mirrors, it showed beauty only by hiding the cracks beneath. When the scholars unearthed her letters centuries later, they expected revelation. Instead, they found silence, carefully wrapped in words. She wrote of diplomacy, of faith, too of duty, but never of feeling. There was no confession, no wound exposed, only the gleaming armor of intellect. Yet between the lines, something trembled, a rhythm of exhaustion, a pulse of longing. Even her handwriting betrayed the duality of her nature, the letters sharp and elegant, the pressure heavy, as though carved rather than written, as though every word was forced from her hand with effort. In those faded pages, historians saw not just a queen but a survivor of herself. They began to understand that her mastery of power was not born of ambition, but of necessity. Power had been her shelter, the only place she could hide from the memory of being helpless. It was that helplessness that haunted her the most, not the executions, not the betrayals, not the politics of men who underestimated her, but the small, private fears that no crown could protect her from, the night terrors that made her wake gasping for air, the phantom footsteps she thought she heard approaching her door, the recurring dream of her mother kneeling in white, head bowed before the sword. These were the things that shaped her far more than strategy or empire. She had been a child in a world that taught her every act of love was a prelude to loss, and that lesson had written itself into her bones. By the time she reached the throne, she was not merely a ruler, she was an armor given human form. And yet, beneath that armor, a strange tenderness endured. She loved music, especially the soft pluck of a lute at dusk. She adored small dogs and wild roses, though she scolded her maids for bringing them inside. She would pause mid-sentence when she saw the first snowfall, her eyes following the flakes as though remembering something she had lost long ago. There were nights when she made her ladies dance with her, laughter spilling into the cold air, her movements sharp but graceful, as if for a moment she had escaped the weight of her title. In those rare flashes, the woman beneath the crown flickered to life, fragile and human and fleeting. But by morning she would have sealed herself away again. The queen restored, the heart once more hidden behind layers of paint and command. The more time separated her from the living world, the more people forgot that she had ever been human at all. They spoke of her as an era rather than a person, her name standing in for the age itself. Elizabethan. It came to mean brilliance, glory, progress, the golden light before the shadow. But the woman who gave that age its name had spent her life in twilight, balancing between power and fear, life and memory. She had built her golden world from loneliness and sleepless nights. She had ruled because she could not rest. Perhaps that is why her reign glittered so fiercely, because every spark was struck against the darkness inside her. When tourists stand before her tomb now, a few notice how small it is compared to her legend. The marble effigy shows her lying in calm repose, hands folded, eyes closed in peace. But if you stand long enough, if you let the quiet settle around you, Something in the air shifts. It feels as though she is merely pretending to sleep. That if the candles flicker just once too loudly, she might open her eyes. The stone seems alive with withheld breath. Guides call it imagination, but the abbey clerks know better. They have seen the candles gutter when her name is spoken. The faint chill that runs through the chapel on the anniversary of her death. The Virgin Queen may have died 4 centuries ago, but the power she carried, the will that refused to yield, still hums through the stones that hold her. In old letters and diaries, there are accounts from those who claim to see her after death. A monk in the 17th century swore he saw her walking near the river at dusk, her gown trailing light, her face serene. A maid in the 18th wrote that she appeared by her bedside, whispering, "Remember me before fading like smoke." Even in the modern age, guards at Westminster report hearing soft music in the dark, the faint scent of rosewater drifting through the crypt. It may be superstition, or perhaps it is something deeper, the persistence of a spirit that refuses to be forgotten. Elizabeth had once said that her name would live so long as men have tongues to speak, and it seems that prophecy has fulfilled itself beyond her imagining. And yet, immortality is not peace. Legends do not rest, they repeat. Each retelling resurrects her, not as she was, but as the world wishes her to be. One century paints her as saint, another as tyrant, another as lonely heroine. Each story uses her, just as those around her once did, reshaping her to fit their needs. Perhaps that is the cruelest fate of all, to be remembered by everyone and known by no one. To live forever in the mouths of strangers, while the truth of your heart dissolves with every telling, still as spirit endures her, not as ghost or goddess, but as a kind of echo, a reminder that greatness and sorrow often share the same root. Her life remains a warning whispered through the corridors of time, that power without love is its own form of death, and that to make oneself immortal is to abandon the comfort of being understood. Even now, when the rain falls against the windows of Westminster and thunder rolls across the Thames, it seems to speak her name, soft and steady, as if the world itself cannot stop calling her back. And somewhere in that endless echo, perhaps she still stands Elizabeth Tudor, the queen who outlived her enemies, outwitted her lovers, and outlasted her own mortality. Her story moves like a tide that never recedes. A haunting, a promise, a confession too vast for words. She was a woman carved into myth, a body turned into empire, a soul transformed into history. And as long as the river runs and the bells of London toll, her name will remain half prayer, half curse, a sound between silence and eternity. Time does not erase her. It only changes the way the world dreams of her. 4 centuries after her death, Elizabeth's story still shimmers at the edge of memory. Part shadow, part flame. The world she built has long since turned to dust, her palaces swallowed by silence, her courtiers buried beneath stone, her lineage extinguished. And yet she remains, floating between myth and history, like smoke that refuses to rise or fade. Every age rediscovers her. Every heart that listens in the quiet finds a piece of her still beating somewhere between fear and glory. She has become more than a queen now. She is a question the centuries keep asking. The historians write her name carefully, as if it might still burn their ink. They argue whether she was ruthless or righteous, visionary or vain, saint or serpent. But perhaps they all miss the point. Elizabeth was not meant to be understood. She was meant to be felt like the weight of twilight, like the echo of footsteps in an empty corridor, like the ache of something almost beautiful but just beyond reach. Her reign was not simply a chapter of power, it was the performance of survival. She taught a world ruled by men what it meant to endure without surrender. And that endurance, sharp as glass and quiet as prayer, outlived them all. In the silence of Westminster Abbey, her marble effigy lies still, eyes closed, hands folded, the eternal image of peace. But peace was never her companion. The marble lies. Beneath it, beneath the centuries of dust and devotion, the truth stirs like breath beneath a veil. She was not carved from serenity, but from terror, terror of weakness, of discovery, of the bed that waited for her, of the softness she could never allow herself to feel. Every triumph she claimed was born from fear mastered into brilliance. Every act of cruelty was a shield raised against her own reflection. And perhaps that is why her name endures, because it speaks to the part of every soul that has ever stood trembling and called it strength. Sometimes, when the candles in the abbey flicker, it feels as though she listens. The wind moves through the nave like a sigh, carrying whispers of her name. And for a heartbeat, the centuries fold. The world outside grows quiet, and you can almost see her there again, the pale woman with the crown heavy on her head, her eyes bright with sleepless knowing, her voice soft as ash. She is not angry, nor forgiving, only watching the living still chase the same illusions she once mastered: power, control, reverence, immortality, and wondering if any of them will understand what they cost. In life, she had built her crown from contradiction. She was virgin and temptress, saint and sinner, monarch and orphan. She ruled through illusion because truth would have destroyed her. And yet, when the mask finally cracked, what slipped through was not weakness but wisdom, the quiet realization that power cannot fill the void it creates. That realization is her legacy, not her victories, not her empire, not the golden age that bore her name, but the silence that followed, a silence heavy with knowledge too terrible and too beautiful to speak aloud. Every nation carries its ghosts, but England carries hers in daylight. Her image glows on walls, in films, in words, reborn again and again in every generation's need to believe in a woman who could hold a kingdom and never falter. Yet those who listen closely can hear the truth humming beneath the myth that she did falter. Again and again. And each time she rose, it cost her something she could never reclaim. She became eternal not by being flawless, but by refusing to collapse under the weight of her flaws. That is the secret she left behind, hidden not in her crown but in her quiet defiance. When the river mist rises at dawn, drifting over the water where her funeral barge once passed, it looks almost like breath. The same Thames that carried her to her coronation carried her away in death, and its current still murmurs her name. Sometimes, just before sunrise, the city grows eerily still, and the first light strikes the spires of Westminster like a crown of fire. In that moment, it feels as though she is still there, her presence woven into the very air, her story clinging to the stones that remember her footsteps. She is not gone. She has simply changed shape. Because legends do not die, they evolve. And Elizabeth was never content to be mortal. She turned herself into a myth, not out of vanity, but out of survival. She made her pain into poetry, her fear into empire, her solitude into sanctuary. The world called her the Virgin Queen. But in truth, she was the eternal witness, the soul who stood between love and power and chose to carry both alone. She had no children. Yet every woman who refuses to be less than what she is carries her blood. She left no heirs. Yet her voice lingers in the rhythm of every defiance that has ever begun, with the words, "I will not yield." There is something holy in that defiance. Something that does not belong to time. Even now, when the bells toll on cold London evenings, their echo sounds like her pulse steady, unbroken, alive. The marble effigy will crumble one day, The abbey will darken. The world will move on. But her name will remain like a quiet fire beneath the ashes of history. She is not memory, but momentum. Not relic, but reminder. And so the story ends where it began, in silence. The candle gutters, the shadows deepen, and somewhere beyond the reach of sight stands a woman in white. Her face pale and watchful, her crown faintly gleaming in the half-light. She does not speak. She does not need to. Her presence is enough. The centuries bow before her, and the darkness bends to her will, for she is not only Elizabeth of England. She is the voice that whispers through time itself, the queen who never lay down, the woman who refused to end, the spirit that stands forever between the living and the legend. And if you listen closely, if you let the world grow still enough, you might hear her yet, the faint sound of silk against stone, the echo of breath behind the veil, and the quiet, steady heartbeat of a woman who turned her fear into eternity.